In our previous episode, we examined the story of Bill and Liz Rich, whose lives were turned upside down by supernatural activity after moving into a remote Welsh farmhouse. Having suffered years of torment, the unexpected arrival of a spiritualist seemed to herald an end to their suffering, but as they would soon discover, their battle was only just beginning. Bill and Liz nervously exchanged glances as the neatly dressed visitor in his mid-50s introduced himself. He said his name was Larry Harry, and went on to explain how he was a spiritualist medium based in Cardiff. With him were two other men, also mediums from the Netherlands. Harry related how he had learned of the couple's plight through a friend in nearby Brecon, and was certain that he and his associates could alleviate their suffering. Although initially skeptical, Bill eventually agreed to the intervention, and then watched as their visitors got to work, conducting a thorough walkthrough of the premises. Harry and his associates would go on to relate how they'd identified 4 distinct energies residing in the farmhouse, completely unseen by the Rich family. These included the spirits of an old woman and of 2 younger men who seemed to be locked in a permanent state of conflict with one another. But whilst these 3 spirits could be reasoned with, it was the 4th entity they had encountered that was of far greater concern. Harry explained that this spirit was far older and darker than the others, one which they had struggled to even communicate with. When feeling its presence, Harry sensed that its focus was solely on possessing Lawrence, Bill's eldest son. Consequently, he had implored Bill to send Lawrence away from the farmhouse in the hope of denying it any further access to the boy. Reluctantly, Bill arranged for his son to move into a flat in Brecon, sparking a heated argument that would severely strain their relationship. By this time, Liz had given birth to their second child, a daughter called Becca, and Lawrence accused his father of not loving him and of pushing him away to prioritise his new family. This turmoil caused Bill more pain than any of the incidents which had come before it, making him question his sanity and the possibility of ever returning to normality. Unable to come to terms with having estranged his own son, Bill further slumped into a depression, drinking heavily despite his wife's attempts to intervene. But gradually, as each day passed, it soon appeared that sending Lawrence away had been the right thing to do. The instances of loud whirring created by the electricity meter began to decrease, along with the nauseating foul odours which had surged through the premises. A surprise visit from their neighbour, Wyn Thomas, was also taken as a sign of better fortune. The farmer's animosity had softened somewhat as he empathised with the suffering they had faced. In an effort to make amends for his previous attitude, Thomas asked if he might commission Bill to produce a painting of his horse, Echo. Naturally, Bill was only too happy to oblige and threw himself into this new project. For a time, it seemed to Liz that her husband was back to his old self again, but as the weeks rolled by, his mental health began to deteriorate once more. Frustration over minor mistakes in the painting led to fits of rage, causing him to cut and slash canvases that could have easily been corrected. Recreating the horse's right hind leg proved to be an ongoing challenge for Bill, which he would inexplicably and unintentionally distort whenever he reached that stage of the painting. It would take months of failed attempts before Bill finally got it right. With the rest of the project proceeding smoothly, he soon handed the finished article over to Wynne Thomas, who was ecstatic with the result. However, this would soon change. One evening, Bill received a phone call from his neighbour, who proceeded to rant and rave at him. Almost spitting his words down the phone line, Thomas explained that he had found echo at the exact spot in the field which Bill had recreated in the painting. He had somehow broken his right hind leg, and was in such agony that he had to be euthanized. Bill had previously explained to his neighbour the reason for the delay in finishing the painting, and because of this, Thomas concluded the call by declaring that he wanted nothing more to do with him, and saying that Bill's family must have been cursed by the devil. Even in her worst nightmares, Liz could never have imagined the consequences of this exchange. Her husband became a ghost of his former self, spending days on end drinking in his studio, whilst producing nothing in the process. When he did emerge to interact with her and the children, she noticed what presented as horrific injuries to his hands. His skin there was swollen, to the point where it would split into wide open welts, as if he had gashed himself with a razor. After visiting a doctor in Brecon, the various medications which had been prescribed seemed to control the swelling, but did nothing to help his irrational mood swings. On one of the rare occasions when she had convinced Bill to leave the house on an errand, Liz decided to take Ben and Becca out for a walk in the surrounding fields. She had returned to the house in high spirits, with the children having apparently enjoyed being out in the sunshine and away from the premises. But as she had re-entered the residence from the barn, she was gripped by an overwhelming feeling of foreboding, as if she could sense the presence of another person in the house with them. Standing by the stairs with the children behind her, Liz looked into the hallway, listening for any movement. Suddenly, a dark hulking entity, around 7 or 8 feet tall, materialized from the wall directly opposite. It was a roughly humanoid form, but with the shape of a bird's head, and it seemed to walk up the hallway before disappearing through the thick stone wall near the meter. The deathly silence that followed was then shattered by the sound of the whirring meter and the panicked screams of her children. The incident involving the shadowy trespasser was so deeply traumatic that Liz insisted Bill take the family directly to her grandmother's house in Cowbridge. During their time at this larger residence, the couple argued over how to resolve their situation, with Liz wanting to move and Bill wanting to stay put. Nevertheless, they had invested in a set of baby monitors, and it was through these devices that it soon became apparent that whatever was afflicting the family was far from tethered to the old farmhouse. One night, whilst watching television, Liz heard the faint whispering of voices coming from a nearby monitor. Sending Bill to check on the children, she listened in, hearing the distinct sounds of her husband opening the door and entering the room. There followed a few moments of silence before Bill closed the door and left. But just as he arrived back in the living room, saying that the children were fast asleep, the whispering voices returned. Bill went to check again, only for the voices to cease as he opened the door. This occurred several times, the voices seeming to whisper to one another in a sinister and haunting manner, moving closer and then further away from the monitor, as if walking back and forth across the room. Concerned for the safety of her children, Liz decided to have them sleep with her and Bill for the remainder of their stay. With Bill increasingly incapacitated by his alcoholism and Liz pushed to her very limits, she turned to the church for help. She was directed to Reverend David Holmwood, who was known in the Baptist community as an expert in exorcism. The Reverend attentively listened to what the couple had experienced in their home and expressed a willingness to help rid them of whatever was causing the phenomena. After several months of preparation, Holmwood installed himself at Heol Fanog, aided by an American assistant who he claimed to have freed from possession in a previous incident. Almost immediately, their presence provoked a strong and at times violent reaction, with the foul odours returning along with the aggressive whirring of the electricity meter and a series of paralysing temperature drops. Seeing the torment inflicted upon the Rich family, Holmwood formed the opinion that whatever dark force was responsible had a particular fixation on Bill, apparently taking hold of and possessing the artist and forcing him to paint increasingly horrifying and traumatic visions. These depictions showed dark figures with red eyes, staring back at Bill from the canvas, sometimes missing limbs or other body parts that appeared to be severed. Holmwood instructed Bill to instead paint religious imagery in his studio and conducted multiple aggressive exorcisms in the presence of the artist during this process. But the force Holmwood was battling would only intensify its resistance, further ensnaring Bill and pushing him towards the edge of his sanity. His behaviour became erratic around Liz and the children, hastily retreating to another room and locking himself inside whenever he saw them. He also avoided the kitchen altogether, taking his meals alone, until one day Liz found him curled up in a ball on the kitchen floor, weeping uncontrollably. Through his tears, Bill explained that he had been compelled against his will to go to the knife drawer, experiencing a relentless urge to harm himself. He related how at one time he had taken out a large blade and had just been on the point of stabbing himself in the chest when he managed to regain control. Throwing the knife back in the drawer, he walked out of the kitchen to be sick in the toilet. But on his return, he found the same knife now lying back on the kitchen table, its handle angled directly towards the door, as if inviting him to take it up once again. Liz realised that Holmwood's actions had been not only ineffective, but detrimental, as Bill's condition had worsened. Requesting that the Reverend cease his efforts and leave, she instead began to seek aid from other local residents and historians. Each successive inquiry she made painted a horrifying picture of the farmhouse and the properties which immediately surrounded it. There was a seemingly endless history of brutal murders and tragic suicides, all of which seemed to be focused entirely within the vicinity of Heol Fanog. And it was around this time, at her lowest ebb, that another enigmatic figure entered the family's lives. This time, one who offered them no promise of success, but would go on to achieve far more than any of those who had preceded him. In February of 1993, an unassuming ghost hunter named Eddie Burks garnered national attention for his involvement in an infamous haunting. He had been contacted directly by the owners of Coutts Bank in London, whose staff had been plagued by poltergeist activity. After he visited the building, the disturbance ceased altogether, prompting the national tabloids to somewhat laud him as the genuine article. As a result, he became emboldened by his abilities, and actively sought out other alleged hauntings where he believed he could offer relief to those affected. In March of 1995, this search brought him to the doorstep of Heol Fanog, where he met Liz, who was desperate for any assistance he could provide. Walking patiently through the farmhouse, Burks confirmed that two souls still resided there, people who Liz had already encountered during her research. These were Thomas Edwards, a farm worker who had been beaten to death with an axe on a neighbouring property in 1848, and that of his killer, James Griffiths. Burks explained that neither of these spirits had been able to move on, as they had not been able to process the trauma of their deaths. For Edwards, the realisation that he'd been killed by the man whom he believed to be his best friend had proven far too much for him to accept. But the far more haunting story was the motive behind his murder. Burke stated that there had been a long history of satanic worship in the region, concealed by a select few who practiced it. The previous owners of the Heol Fanog estate had been senior members of this cult-like organisation, conducting numerous dark rituals upon their property. One evening, Thomas Edwards had stumbled across one of their meetings and hurriedly fled the scene, but not before being recognised by several of their number. The landowners had then abducted and threatened his best friend, James Griffiths, coercing him into killing Edwards and threatening violence against his family if he did not. Griffiths had no choice but to agree to the demands of his wealthy and powerful satanic captors, and killed Edwards shortly afterwards. But the promise they had made in preventing him from being sentenced for the murder never came to pass. He was subsequently hanged, taking the motive behind the killing of his best friend to the grave with him, and leaving his soul to forever wander the scene of his unforgivable crime. Burks went on to explain to the family that he had persuaded the two spirits to open an astral doorway and move into the afterlife. But whilst his actions would ultimately end the disturbances at Heol Fanog, they were not without consequence. In the weeks immediately following his visit, there was one final surge of activity at the farmhouse, with the electricity meter suddenly spiking to operate at its highest level ever. The couple was also plagued by visions of several horrifying entities, including a man with half his face having been pulverised. Burks later explained that the temporary doorway he had opened for Edwards and Griffiths may have acted as a beacon for other similar spirits from the surrounding area, desperate to pass on before it closed forever. With the torment finally ended, life returned to what it always should have been for the family, but the damage was already done, leaving too many tainted memories in what had at one time been their dream home. They would eventually leave the property, with their marriage ending in divorce, and Bill passing away as a result of his alcoholism in later years, making him perhaps the last soul to be claimed by the haunted farmhouse and the evils that had dwelt there for hundreds of years. During the rich family's 7 years at Heol Fanog, conflicting theories have emerged. Many observers dismiss any intent to deceive, believing the family sincerely recounted their experiences, citing numerous independent witnesses. The location of the farmhouse on top of converging ley lines is also suggested as a cause, with these mystical fault lines being linked to paranormal events in the Brecon Beacons since medieval times. Others attribute the horrors to Bill's deteriorating mental health, a consequence of alcohol abuse and toxic substances he may have used in his day-to-day activities as an artist. The sinister voices and heavy footsteps he experienced may have been hallucinations, whilst Liz, grappling with isolation and young motherhood, may have become susceptible to her husband's traumatized visions due to sleep deprivation. The involvement of Reverend Holmwood and other mediums may have reinforced the family's supernatural beliefs, leading to poor decisions such as sending Lawrence away, which only exacerbated the situation. However, a distinctive aspect of the Heol Fanog story is the role of the electricity meter, showing spikes which coincided with key events. Were the spirits drawing power from the meter to manifest themselves to the family? Or was it the actions of Bill and Liz affecting the use of power at the farmhouse as they tried to combat increasingly wild figments of their own imaginations? Some reports of hauntings associate power usage with paranormal activity, and paranormal investigators often note inexplicable power loss in their equipment during investigations. This would seem to suggest an intriguing relationship between the electricity used in our daily lives and unseen forces that may simultaneously exist alongside us. Whether the happenings at Heol Fanog were real or imagined, the fear that they instilled amongst not only the rich family, but others who visited the property certainly was. Until next time.